Welcome, folks, to our second installment of this series of video lessons on Build Up to Civil War. This is United States history, and I am Miss Jennifer Blank. I will be your guide on this journey. So let's get started. So last time, this is what we talked about. We talked about a review of some previous content, talked about sectionalism, talked about slavery and abolitionism. Now we're going to look at key causes of the Civil War. In the next video, I'll look at changes in political parties, but today we're focusing on key causes. So let's get started. Okay, there is not just one cause. Now, the primary cause of the Civil War was slavery. That's the primary cause. You cannot have a discussion of what caused the Civil War without discussing slavery. It's impossible. Anybody who tells you that it's states' rights is full of it. Okay, it's not true. You can go and look at the troves of primary sources we have from the period that explicitly state in no uncertain terms, this southern state, insert whichever one you want, is seceding because of slavery, like it's in there, right? But there were a lot of moving parts to the Civil War, and while slavery was the primary cause, it was not the only one. There were other factors at play, and in order to fully understand the period, it's important to understand those other factors. But I do want to make it clear that slavery was the primary cause of the Civil War. So here are our causes. So today we're going to talk about these guys. So we have the Compromise of 1850, which was meant to be a compromise, but really didn't do very much. We're going to talk about violence in the Senate. We're going to talk about sectionalism again because it features prominently. We're going to revisit the Dred Scott, Dred Scott decision. We're going to look at the Wilmot Proviso. Kansas and Nebraska Act is particularly fun. And we're going to look at the election of Abraham Lincoln. So all of these things are going to factor into what led to the outbreak of the Civil War. So, key ideas. I already talked about all of these. I mentioned all of these just a minute ago. Political parties, we're going to get into more detail about that in the next video lesson. But there are some key elections you need to think about. 1848 and 1860 were particularly pivotal in pushing the country on just a downward spiral to civil war. The Kansas-Nebraska, after we're going to detail, we're going to look at violence in the Senate. We're going to look at the Compromise of 1850. So the Wilmot Proviso. So this idea that was proposed in 1846 was to ban all blacks, both free and slave, from the Mexican territory that they seceded in order to preserve land for white farmers. This was an attempt to limit the perceived pro-Southern Polk presidency. So this was messed up. It was completely messed up. But the anti-slavery folks were trying to keep slavery from going to the new territories. In order to do that, if you prevented any black person from going there, you would also prevent slaves from going there and therefore slave owners. So it would effectively prevent slavery in the territories. This did not pass in Congress for a number of reasons, but debate revealed these sectional divides, not party. At this point, the national parties that were holding people together are starting to break down, okay? And they just revealed these divisions, and this resulted in a major shift in politics. So instead of these national political parties sort of anchoring people, they started dividing along sectionalist lines. And this is going to spell disaster for the country. The election of 1848. So slavery in the West was a key issue in the election of 1848. You have a couple of different folks that are vying for the presidency here. You have a Democrat named Lewis Cass. He proposed the idea of popular sovereignty, allowing territorial settlers, not Congress, to decide. You had the Whig candidate that was Zachary Taylor. He would eventually win, and he evaded the issue altogether. He's just like, I'm just not going to talk about that. The Free Soil Party was created by Northern abolitionists who nominated Martin Van Buren, and actually Martin Van Buren was the next vice president under Jackson. But they obviously didn't get anywhere. Whig candidate Zachary Taylor would win the election of 1848. So slavery in the West was a key issue. Now, I want you to understand that free soilers were not abolitionists. They didn't want to get rid of slavery. They just didn't want to expand it into the West. But they weren't for abolition. Abolitionists were something else. Free soilers were not abolitionists. Southern Whigs supported Taylor because he owned slaves. Northern Whigs supported him because he promised to let Congress decide, not popular sovereignty. So he was able to cobble together a coalition, ended up winning. Southern Democrats did like popular sovereignty to let the state conventions decide, and Northern Democrats liked popular sovereignty. So we start to see the split of sectional divides here, and it was split enough that Taylor was able to win the election and win the presidency. Oh, the Compromise of 1850. Henry Clay, who was like the great compromiser, Henry Clay was a very important political figure during this era, and he's like pretty much on his last legs at this point. He's old, he's not doing well, and he's just barely trying to cobble together something that'll keep us from tipping over into war, and it didn't really work. So California was admitted as a free state, according to this compromise. The rest of the new lands, territorial governments were to be formed without restrictions. So basically, the new territory from Mexico was going to be all popular sovereignty. You have abolishment of the slave trade, but not slavery, just in D.C. So that doesn't have much power. Then you have a new fugitive slave law. Now, the federal government is involved in slave catching, okay? So now you've got federal marshals who are rolling around in the free territories looking for slaves that escaped from the South. This was very, very bad. A lot of people in the North didn't like it. They didn't like it for a number of reasons. Number one was the federal government was coming in and trying to mess with what they were trying to do. So that was a problem. Southerners that got mad when President Taylor proposed admitting New Mexico and California states. They thought popular sovereignty would make California a free state. New Mexico had no slaves or a climate adequate for slavery. So in their mind, they were losing out on everything. So we almost seceded here in 1850, right? And Calhoun, yet again, this guy just won't go away. He's leading the charge. He led the Nashville Convention to discuss the possibility of secession. It didn't end up happening at this point, but obviously we know eventually we get there. So here's the original Missouri Compromise line. And now we have some problems here. So the pink, deep pink is free states and territories. Slave states and territories are the lighter purple. And then like the in-between one, which is here, it was left up to territories to decide. So this is going to cause a huge problem because you're now massively upsetting the balance, and the southern states are feeling as though slavery is going to get attacked. They're not wrong, but it should be attacked. But I digress. And this is another map showing basically the same thing, but it's got slightly different color scheme, just a slightly different format. So I like to give you guys a few different options of visuals so that you can sort of work with the one that makes the most sense to you. Now we have this bit. Now I have to be clear. I did not create this slide. This I borrowed from Susan Poher, who has some excellent PowerPoints on this. And so I borrowed this slide. I did not create this myself, but it's really, really good. So there's Calhoun over there, that little angry looking guy. The South must protect slavery and will peacefully secede. I don't know how you peacefully secede, but whatever. Then you've got Webster over here, Daniel Webster representing the North. The North will never accept any kind of secession. And then you've got Henry Clay right there saying, hey, come on, we got to compromise. Like, let's come together on this. But obviously, when you look at these two perspectives, there's not much room for compromise there, right? There's just not much room for that. So the Compromise of 1850 was the last debate of what they called the Great Triumvirate. These three guys working together because they were basically the leader of their separate factions. And they were the three guys that were responsible for cobbling together compromises. And this is really the last one, was the Compromise of 1850. So the Compromise of 1850, this is how it looked. California admitted as a free state, ended the slave trade in Washington, D.C., but not slavery, right? And then you have popular sovereignty that would decide in these territories. Stronger fugitive slave law was created to appease the South. That calmed Calhoun down a little bit. But of course, people in, for example, Boston would post posters like this all over the place. They're like, hey, watch out. Keep a lookout, right? That this was their abolitionist attempt to help people avoid and avert, not get caught by and they called them kidnappers and slave catchers. So they were trying to warn the black population of Boston to be aware and stay away from these people. This was their attempt to help. Of course, Taylor threatened to veto the compromise, but then he dropped dead. So VP Millard Fillmore signed it. So that sort of kept us from tipping over into war in 1850, but about 10 years later, we're going to be there anyway. Oh, Kansas and Nebraska. Kansas and Nebraska. That was one hot mess. So we have the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which was prompted because two new territories were opened to slavery, Kansas and Nebraska. Whoops, got excited. So this declared they would become free or slave states based on their constitutions when they applied for statehood. This effectively got rid of the 3630 line and Missouri Compromise and imposed the Wilmot Proviso in reverse. All new territories would be open to slavery, potentially. So now you have to worry about getting it in the Constitution. If you're abolitionist, you got to get it in the Constitution that we're not slave. If you are pro-slavery, you got to get it in the Constitution that slavery is protected. So this created basically one massive free-for-all, and these different sides just descended on Kansas and Nebraska. It was crazy. So this is what we're talking about. The Kansas and Kansas and Nebraska territory are right here. Now, between 1854 and 58, there were elections held in Kansas, right? There was massive fraud and intimidation, all right? The pro-slavery forces gained control of the Kansas legislature, and they passed this pro-slave constitution, which was called the Lecompton Constitution. But the Free Soil Party said, we're setting up our own government in Topeka. We don't acknowledge that legislature. It's not legitimate. It's not valid. So we're going to set up our own government where we're not going to allow slavery. War erupts between the anti-slavery and pro-slavery forces. In 1856, the pro-slavery forces sacked the Free Soil settlement of Lawrence. Tons of violence. This is why it's called Bleeding Kansas. This is actually the first, unofficial battle of the Civil War. This is when hostilities fully break out between the two factions. So, in 1854, Democrat Stephen Douglas, he hoped to organize the Kansas-Nebraska territories with that act. The Missouri Compromise line was repealed, popular sovereignty was applied, and for the Northerners, they believed compromise with the South was impossible. So we have Kansas and Nebraska was a major cause of the Civil War because open, violent, bloody hostilities just opened up. And this was the first time that it happened on such a large scale. This is going to prove a tipping point in pushing the country to war. Effects. So you have party realignments. Whig Party collapsed. Clay was the head of that party and he died in 1852, so bye-bye. The Know Nothing Party was formed, which was anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic, and you have the Republican Party formed. They wanted to keep slavery out of the territories. They were a combination of the remnants of the Whigs and Free Soilers. So, as I said, violence between the pro and anti-slavery in Bleeding Kansas, that's the first unofficial battle of the Civil War. Okay, this is where we reach a tipping point. And, it's an interesting question. It's something I want to talk about in class. At the point of Bleeding Kansas, was Civil War inevitable? Was this the tipping point? Or was it something else? Could we have come back from this if other things hadn't happened? I don't know. We'll discuss this in class. Sometimes it's interesting to play the what-if game. Oh, Bleeding Sumner, this was fun. So if you think Congress is ridiculous now, well, they actually beat the crap out of each other on the congressional floor. So abolitionist Charles Sumner delivered a speech entitled The Crime Against Kansas. He attacked slavery and the South. So South Carolina Rep. Preston Brooks was so ticked off by this that he attacked him at his desk on the Senate floor with a cane. He just beat him with an inch of his life on the Senate floor. Sumner was injured so severely, and he actually had to step away because he had to recover because he was literally beaten with an inch of his life. So he became a symbol in the North to show that the Southerners were really barbarians and how they were willing to protect this horrible institution of slavery. Meanwhile, Preston Brooks was hailed as a Southern hero. So again, we have this initial, you have initial divides that are happening, but this drives the two sides even further apart. And that, folks, ends our discussion of the key causes of the Civil War. There's more we're going to talk about. Obviously, I can't talk about everything in one video lesson. In class, we're going to look at the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which were important. We're also going to take a closer look at the Underground Railroad in class. And we're going to take a closer look at abolitionists like Frederick Douglass. But I hope you learned what you needed to, and I will see you in the next video.